in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to paint a red squirrel in acrylics. Now, regardless of the subject that I'm working on, I will always paint in the background first. Once I've done that, I transfer my outline and then I start on the eyes. For me, the eyes, this is where all of the emotion and expression stems from, so I want to make sure that I've got those accurate. Now in the corner I have a palette cam. This is brand new for this month. I decided to add this to my Patreon tutorials so that members could see exactly how I mix in my paint, how much water I'm adding to that mixture, because this is something that can really affect the type of details and the layer that we're working on. When you're working with glazes, you're going to be required to use a lot more water in that mixture, and you'll see that throughout this painting process. But for those base layer stages here, I'm trying to get my paint a little bit more opaque. So that means that the paint is going to be a bit thicker. I want to try and hide that background colour. That is my main aim with my first layers. When it comes to then adding some of the details in the fur, we want to be working with what's closest to the skin and then building up from there. How much water you have in your mixture is going to vary on the type of texture that we're able to create. If your details are far too transparent, you're not going to have as much depth within that fur. We need to be able to build this up gradually. And one of the common things that can happen when working with acrylics is that the paint is either too thick, so it doesn't flow off the brush as easily as it should. You can then get some start and stop points within that brush stroke, or you can have too much water in that mixture and then your details are far too transparent. They look really watery. So that's why I'm really excited about this new addition to the Patreon tutorials, because it's going to really help to answer so many questions, so you can see exactly at that time how I mix in all of my colours. And this is also the case for my pastel tutorials when I mix in my pan pastel base layers. So I've already mentioned that I like to work from what's closest to the skin and building up from there. Now what that means is I'm working from dark to light, and that's because we have that lovely ability with acrylics that once that layer underneath has dried, that we can carry on building our lighter layers on top without any issues at all. Now you don't always have to wait for the layers underneath to completely dry. It is going to depend on the type of effect you're creating. So you can do wet on wet blending for your base layer techniques, and that's going to help to really soften your edges. And again, that's things that I show in real-time tutorials on Patreon. Now if you would like to watch this all in real time, it's just over 10 hours of footage on my Patreon channel. You get the reference photo, the line art and full material list, so all of the colours and the brushes that I have used. So if that is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for painting realistic fur. If that's of interest, I will link that in the description below as well. And one of those top tips is using multiple brushes to get as much depth as you can in the fur. And I'm demonstrating that here with this squirrel. I'm using a range of brushes. I've got filberts, liners, I've got some rake brushes, some ordinary round brushes, depending on the type of area, the type of texture that I'm currently working on. And this will really help to build up more of that depth. What happens is if we have a tendency of using one brush for the very first layer and then that same brush throughout the additional detailed layers, that fur detail is all going to look the same. So I would recommend having 2 or 3 different brushes so that you can build up the various types of texture within that fur. Because the fur texture that's closest to the skin is very different to the fur that's sat on the very top. Once you've decided the brush that you want to use for that layer, it's then about how to use that brush. So where should you hold it? How much pressure should you apply? How thick should that paint be? All of these factors come into play. Take this current layer that I'm working on at the moment. So this is a glaze. I am just thinning down my mixture with water. I'm not using any glazing medium. And once the layer underneath is completely dry, I'm going to use a glaze to adjust the colour of those details. Now this is perfect if colour selection and mixing those colours is something that you stress about, because by working with glazes in this way to adjust the colour, you only have to do that process once. You can do a painting in black and white and adjust the colour with a glaze at the last layer. It's more than fine to do that. It really does help to take the pressure off if you do find colour mixing and worrying about matching that exact colour to the photo quite stressful. Focus on your values first, get your lights and your darks in place, build up that texture, and then you can adjust that colour with these glazes. Once I'm happy with the glaze that I've put in place, as you can see here, I'm now going back in and adding my details. Now, although you can do one glaze at the end for adjusting that colour, that is absolutely fine. My preference is to work with glazes throughout my painting process, and you can see that on all of my YouTube tutorials. The reason why that is my preference is I like to look at my reference photo and my painting and know that it looks like that animal, regardless if it's a wildlife subject or a pet portrait. For me, it helps to keep me far more motivated, and I'm more likely to stick at that painting in each day, because obviously I do a lot of painting for my tutorials. I don't want to ever get to the point where I get bored. So I do find, like now for instance, this face of this red squirrel, it does look like my reference photo. I could easily leave it here for my first painting session and come back to it the following day feeling just as motivated, because I feel like I've already achieved a lot more. The contrast is right, the colour is getting there, not quite there because again I've got more glazes to add, but it is comfortably looking like that photo. So if you are someone who does find yourself hesitating a little bit, not quite sure where you should be on that photo, break it down into small sections and slow that process down. Now, something I talk a lot about in every single tutorial on Patreon and on YouTube is the importance of the base layer. For me personally, it's one of the most important layers. Not only do I want to try and hide the colour of that background, that first layer is really important for that, but also this is our foundation for our details. If you look at how I'm using this liner brush, it's already looking more realistic, even though this is my first layer of detail, because I've already got a nice texture built up with my base layer foundation. So before we progress onto any further detailed layers on the body, if the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video are useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and a like, because it makes a huge difference. If you also want to get notified of future content and the tutorials I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button. So another element that I talk in depth on all of my tutorials is fur direction. Now this is really important because the fur direction is never random regardless of the fur texture. It changes direction because it's indicating at the underlying bone and muscular structure. So if that fur direction is incorrect, we will change what that animal looks like. So for instance, the top part of the chest, that's where the shoulder blades are on this red squirrel, and you've got the rib cage as well. So because this squirrel is stood upright and the arm is leaning over onto one part of the tree branch, I want to make sure that I'm replicating that. If the fur direction was drawn too flat, it's just not going to have the same feel. So that is always my main tip with any fur, is always make sure you get that fur direction accurate. Whilst painting the fur direction, we also need to be focusing on the fur length and the fur thickness. Now these two areas are also just as important. One thing that you can do to make this easier is to print out your reference photo the same size as your artwork. That will enable you to see exactly how long that fur is in that one area that you're painting. Now colour for printers can be expensive with those ink cartridges, so you can just print that out in black and white. You're not using that to get the exact colour of your subject. For me, I like to use a tablet at the side of my easel for that. But in order just to gauge how long that fur is in that area, a black and white copy of that reference photo would be more than adequate. So when it comes to the body or any element that is behind another object, like this branch here, this is in front of that red squirrel. I want to make sure that I'm replicating that when I come to painting it. So here you can see with my details, I have overlapped that onto where that branch is going to be. I know then that there's not going to be a green halo from the background in between my subject and the edge of that branch. Now for this tutorial on YouTube, I am just going to keep this as the red squirrel. The next one I'm going to be uploading how to paint the branch, because that is a bit more of a trickier texture to get right. So I'm going to split this one up into two tutorials. Now the hand of this red squirrel is quite difficult. There's a few different shapes going on there, and it doesn't necessarily look right at the first few stages. That can then force our brain to paint things that we don't actually see in that reference photo. So if you do have any element of the painting that's particularly tricky, what you can do is turn that painting upside down and do the same to your reference photo, and then your brain will be forced to see it as abstract shapes rather than, in this case, that squirrel's hand. The whiskers of any painting are so important. They make a real difference to the overall feel of that piece. Because they overlap everything else, they sit in front, they add so much more depth. That's why I always recommend to leave those till the last layers. Painting long lines like this can be quite tricky, so I have made a video here on YouTube and it's sharing some top tips on how you can paint lines just like this. So if that's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. I don't often turn my paintings round like this because of how I'm recording them for the tutorials, but sometimes it does really help to just get a better angle for that one line that you're painting. So if you do feel that that's a better position, just turn that artwork round so you can then drag that brush in towards your wrist at a better angle. You're able to get a bit more leverage on that brush. So I really hope the tips and techniques that I've shared in this video have been useful. If they were, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up, and don't forget, if you want to get notified of future content, to hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be uploading another video in the next few days, but if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. If my slower in-depth tutorials on Patreon are of interest, I do also have a Patreon library on my website which has a full list of all of the tutorials that are immediately available as soon as you sign up. And as previously mentioned, I'm going to be uploading the bark section in a separate tutorial, so keep an eye out for that. And as always, thank you so much for watching.